Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are, and happy Wednesday. Happy Peikoff Wednesday. Yes, it's Peikoff Wednesday, our opportunity to review the writings and essays of Leonard Peikoff. And we have, for the better part of a year now, been enjoying, been studying, been working this outstanding work of Leonard Peikoff's. Well, the outstanding work were his podcasts for years. For years, Leonard Peikoff answered questions by listeners to his radio show and fans of Leonard Peikoff and fans of Ayn Rand and Objectivism. And they were compiled. They were compiled in this outstanding volume, Keeping It Real, bringing ideas down to earth. And I have the honor, I have the privilege, I have the pleasure of spending time with James Valliant, talking about these questions and answers. And James, how are you doing on this fine Wednesday?
I am doing most outstandingly. I'm fantastic at all times, as you know, but I'm doing particularly well today.
Well, that's good. I am keeping it real, like the book says. I'm also keeping it positive. And the reason I am is because we're going to talk about something. And sometimes it gets approached with a little more venom. And we're going to keep it real. We're going to keep it to the facts. This is important. These are ideas that are going to touch all of us, that all of us can apply, get a little more oomph out of these ideas. And the question is, well, Ayn Rand had a few close associates that she later broke relationships with. Now, we could characterize that in a much more dramatic fashion if we were clickbaity, but no, this is important to you, to me, to everybody listening. Why was she unable to predict the evil acts of her associates? And is there anything, and this is the question, is there anything that we can learn from the experience? Now, I want to say right up front, flat out, I want to see you, and I mean the listeners. Those of you who are listening live, I want to see you in the YouTube chat. If you're catching this afterward on the podcast, I want to see you in the YouTube comments. I would love to see you with a super chat or super thanks to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. But either way, this is a topic we want to hear what you've got to say, both your own thoughts and your own reactions to Leonard Peikoff's answers that we are going to share. Because again, this is stuff that for me, and I think for anybody of us who are fans of Ayn Rand and Ayn Rand's ideas, especially those of you who consider yourself objectivists, this is going to be powerful stuff.
You know,
Henderson in the chat right away says, the passion of Ayn Rand's critics? Yes, the passion of Ayn Rand's critics. James, you have got to get the second printing of that book out there. Of course, we've got copies here at Casa della Nasir, but more people need to read that work, both your insights on what happened and the second half, Ayn Rand's personal journal entries that were shared. Fascinating, heartbreaking, infuriating, all powerful stuff.
Thank you very much. And I do intend to come out with a second edition of it as soon as possible, practically possible. But I do want to amplify your throwing out there the idea that we are encouraging questions here. I'm going to focus on the philosophical substance, or at least try to, but I don't want that to discourage anyone from asking questions. And I'm happy to name the names involved here. Nathaniel Brandon, Barbara Brandon, Murray Rothbard, John Hospers, even David Kelly. If anyone wants to raise issues that are connected with them, please do so by giving a super chat, and I'm happy to answer those questions. But hopefully we can keep it philosophically focused today. We have such a great expert himself, Mr. Robert Nasir here, who's always complimenting me, and I'm never returning the compliment. He's always saying I'm such an expert, but I want to say Mr. Robert Nasir is at least the expert I am on these matters. We're both students of objectivism, and he's at least as wise as I am on so much. So thank you, Robert.
Well, I appreciate that, but it is good, James, to have you on hand, because you have been not only involved in the objectivist movement for longer than I have, but you were intimately involved with some of the players, including some of the people that you mentioned. So I know that you've got even more insights than I do on this. Let me jump into Leonard Peikoff's Q&A here, and then we're going to talk about both of these some more. But you're right. I want to hear from folks in the chat. I want to hear your comments, your experiences, any questions that you've got about what we have to say. Let me start with question number one, because Leonard Peikoff was asked, well, why was a great mind like Ayn Rand unable to catch in the act the evil characters among her one-time associates? And that's the end of the question there. My immediate reaction to that there is, yes, Ayn Rand was a great mind, And sometimes when we're covering these controversies and the ups and the downs and the breaks and the movement, we forget just how incredible her mind was. When I read her writings, when I read both the fiction, Atlas Shrugged in particular, but The Fountainhead and Anthem and We the Living and the shorter pieces as well, I'm bowled over by her abilities as a fiction writer. But then I read The Virtue of Selfishness and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and read the compilation Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff. She was a stunning intellect, just once in an era mind. So yes, why was a great mind like Ayn Rand unable to catch in the act the evil characters among her one-time associates? And let me read the beginning of Leonard Peikoff's answer. He says, well, judging people is the hardest intellectual task there is. This is Leonard Peikoff. In my opinion, it is still the hardest task. Ayn Rand at the end of her life told me that she knew less about people at the end than she thought she knew at the beginning, simply because they are so bewilderingly inconsistent. Let me stop the quote from Leonard Peikoff there. For Leonard Peikoff to say, and I don't question his veracity on this, that Ayn Rand felt she knew less about people at the beginning than the end, and yet to read her philosophical and psychological insights, what comes out both in her fiction and her nonfiction, again, both stunning, but also makes perfect sense in terms of explaining what happened in her relationships.
Yeah. People are complex. People are mixed bags. People are not honest about themselves. Sometimes people don't do the introspection so they even have this understanding of themselves. So it is, impossible to predict human behavior in one sense. It's true that when you develop a very deep knowledge of someone over a period of years, you begin to understand their moral character, their in effect, their moral habits. But even then we can be surprised. Even then people can make bad choices, and also people can present a front. People can superficially present exactly what Ayn Rand wanted to hear. And that made it all the more difficult for her. She had certain challenges in this regard that other people do not face. Ayn Rand's ideas were so revolutionary, and people would get them at different levels. And if they got it at one level, say an aesthetic sense of life level, they could project to her so much more because she trusted that aspect, the sense of life response. And that is not necessarily a consistent indicator of what someone's conscious thinking is. More than that, people can outright lie about what they understand. And we will find that in several of these cases, that's exactly what happened. They were impressed by Ayn Rand, and they just simply outright lied about what was going on in their head, even as they were giving Ayn Rand all kinds of overt praise, which was itself dishonest in a sense.
Exactly right. Now, you wanted chat, and we've got some great comments in the chat because Bonnie Bertrand is in the chat and says, and I swear I was going to say this, volition is real. You get to know a person, you understand their character, their ethical behavior over the course of time. You understand a bit about their psychology, where they've been and what they might be likely to do based on that. But there's always that element of whatever their vehicle, whatever they are, there's a driver there who's always got the option of saying, yeah, I'm going to turn in a better direction, or I'm going to do the worst possible thing. I'm just going to stop thinking about what I should do. I'm going to evade my knowledge. So Bonnie's absolutely right. Volition is real. And you can come to understand people, and yet they can still come to surprise you. That has to be the case. We're not determinists. Robin in the chat says, well, you want to see the best in people you trust, as one should. You can't be paranoid and assume your friends will betray you. And that's absolutely right, even though we also know it's always possible that somebody will betray you. But character is a thing, and it is something that you can rely on, at least to a substantial degree.
Ayn Rand's character was just that way. We really only have direct access to our own consciousness. Everything I know about anyone else, no matter how well I know them, my wife that I've known for decades, we only have direct access to our own mind. And there's a tendency for us to project that onto other people. Ayn Rand was a very benevolent person, and she was mining for gold. and she was ignoring the lumps of coal along the way. She wanted benevolence. She wanted to meet people who could respond to her. More than that, she was such a genius, she didn't really recognize that when she would say something, people wouldn't grasp its full implications and applications. And so very frequently people would come to her with a question they thought was brand new. Well, Miss Rand, what about this? And she would say, well, I explained this in the Fountainhead, or I explained this in Atlas Shrugged. How did you miss it? I say, well, I read that 6 times. How could I have missed that, Miss Rand? And she would point out, no, right over here. And oh, wow, of course, you were addressing that. I read it on an entirely different level. And so Ayn Rand projected, when you read her book and you said, oh, I agree with what you're saying, Miss Rand, she projected the full understanding on you, even if it didn't apply. If that makes any sense as well.
Oh, yes, yes. And I know Leonard Peikoff has spoken about that, not in today's topic, but yes, in his discussion of my 30 years with Ayn Rand, when asked about Ayn Rand's anger and whether her anger was justified, whether she ever got angry with him. And he explained it in just those terms, that you could say something to Ayn Rand and Ayn Rand would know all of the implications of what you said or what you asked. And if she had thought that, or if she had asked that, it would have meant something, for example, terrible, even though, somebody like me wouldn't realize, oh yeah, the implications of what I asked. If I fully understood that, it would have been outrageous to ask that question. But I'm not Ayn Rand. I don't have that intellect.
Right, right. And even some of those who were most deeply impressed with Ayn Rand and impressed her with their love for her work really didn't understand certain things. And they hid that knowledge from Ayn Rand, I think, just to maintain their relationship with Ayn Rand. I think we'll see that in various cases.
Yeah, I think that that has to be part of, you can't make sense of it all without that as a substantial part of the explanation. So Leonard Peikoff goes on, she generally went by their avowed statements and actions, not by their emotional projections or vibrations. Though she tried to pick that up, but she tried to go by what she could tell objectively. Now, the problem is that there are great, great actors. They're not all up on stage, who can take over the ideas of a philosophy and grasp exactly how to formulate them. Well, they don't in any way sound like a parrot. You can see one on the stage and you would swear that this man 100% understands these ideas and they are completely integrated into his life. It's inconceivable that it's an act, and yet it is an act. How one ferrets this out, especially if you don't know the private life of the person, I don't know. Sometimes Ayn Rand would give people the benefit of the doubt on the grounds that here was a possible value. And I should say, Bonnie in the chat quoted you, you're mining for gold, and exactly right there. He goes on, sometimes that proved to be a mistake. I mean, if there was nothing definite and some seemingly good quality, sometimes the evil, like a virus, nourished itself because someone who was considered really honest and rational had vouched for somebody who would then carry on the act. I think that's something that doesn't always come out of these close quote there, that doesn't always come out of these discussions, is it wasn't just that Ayn Rand was completely blindsided by a stranger, but she had people that she knew, people she trusted, and people that those folks knew and trusted brought others into the circle who could put on this incredible act. Well, running an objectivist group here in Southeast Michigan, we've certainly seen that before too. Oh, I've got this friend of mine who really needs to come. Oh, great, bring him along. And he would come and he would, I'm thinking of a couple of people in particular who would really put on the act of intellectual interest. And it would either eventually peter out and they were really just looking for a casual social group and had very little interest in Ayn Rand and her ideas, or it would be a way of getting a little cachet in the group before they got in their soapbox and said, oh, well, everybody I know says Ayn Rand's a crank, and I don't know. So we've certainly seen that at the local level.
It goes all the way up to those closest at one time with Ayn Rand. Someone like Nathaniel Branden, in his own memoirs that he published after Ayn Rand's death, confesses his own ignorance, confusion, and disagreement that he was suppressing and not revealing to Ayn Rand. He had these growing doubts, he said. Now, if you're the main intellectual spokesman for someone, and you're having growing intellectual doubts. And he admits he never brought it up with Ayn Rand. He never questioned Ayn Rand about this. And there's a profound moral distinction in my mind between someone like Nathaniel Branden, who is beginning to develop doubts over a period of years, or confusions or questions, and not bringing them up at all with Ayn Rand. This person, he says, is the greatest genius that he's ever known and met. He's devoting his life to teaching her ideas, and he does not bring up his questions, his doubts, his problems, his confusions. I contrast that sharply with Dr. Leonard Peikoff. Dr. Peikoff got in trouble with Ayn Rand on more than one occasion because he said, I don't understand, I disagree, no, this isn't right. And Ayn Rand would push back, sometimes with anger. But rather than risk Rand's anger, Nathaniel Branden lied to Ayn Rand about the intellectual contents of his brain, as he is profiting from being the teacher of her ideas and her most important public spokesman in the 1960s. Dr. Peikoff said, I don't understand. I don't get this. Ayn, could you please explain it to me? And sometimes it would take months or years to, as he explains, to work out that problem. The classic case, for example, describes his rationalism as he was writing The Ominous Parallels. He would write a chapter that he was so proud of. Ayn Rand would say, well, I don't know what you're saying here. Why did you write this? It would leave him completely confused. He realized that he didn't really grasp Ayn Rand's method, and he now had to do a deeper dive into his own psychoepistemology, the kind of courageous introspection that Nathaniel Branden dishonestly refused to engage in. Now, his behavior afterwards is still worse, and maybe we can get into that later.
Well, since you wanted comments from the chat, Ann M says, well, their relationship became toxic. He felt she was trying to keep him in a relationship he didn't want to be in.
Or so he said.
Yes.
That's the first one.
Now, even if I take him at his word, okay, imagine you find yourself in that situation. Somebody's trying to keep you in a relationship you don't want to be in for, again, weeks or months, but years?
Well, first of all, it's a lie. One of the great lies of Nathaniel Branden's memoirs is just exactly that. Ayn Rand was constantly giving him outs from the relationship. Is it our age, their personal relationship? Yeah. Is it our difference? I could understand that. No, don't. At one point in their relationship, she suggested that he have an affair with someone else. It was not jealousy. It was not an attempt to keep her. For the last several months of their relationship, she had clearly stated that their personal relationship was gone, and all she was trying to do was preserve a professional relationship with him to the extent that she could. So when the Brandens say such things, you know it is an outright lie. And I know it to be an outright lie from having read Ayn Rand's personal journals, which are reproduced in my book, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, where Ayn Rand makes all of these points quite clearly. No, indeed, Nathaniel Branden sought her out as a psychological counselor while lying about both his intellectual and personal life with her. Month after month after month, he's continuing these intellectual and personal lies with Ayn Rand in a fraudulent attempt, as a psychotherapist, mind you, to get psychological help from Ayn Rand. So no, no, no. The break had nothing to do with Ayn Rand's jealousy. It had nothing to do with Ayn Rand attempting to maintain a personal relationship with him. No, that's just a lie.
Well, it's another reason why I'm looking forward to a second edition of your book. It's one thing when folks will say, well, but people lie to themselves. They put on a front to themselves to make themselves feel better. If folks could read those journal entries, these were written for no reason. They were never intended to be read by anybody else during her lifetime. Although she left them behind, I've heard objections. They shouldn't have been printed. Well, she left those behind and told Leonard Peikoff, well, once I'm gone, whatever you authorize was fine by me. But the
second the Brandens published their public lies about her personal life,
yes,
suddenly it is relevant. So she doesn't get a say. She doesn't get her response. No, they only wanted their answer. And Nathaniel Branden explicitly said that Leonard Peikoff was seeking profit in publishing these notes that were published in my book. Leonard Peikoff gave those to me without a dime. And you can see that kind of assault, personal assault on Leonard Peikoff, which is both a lie and revelation in my mind that he knew that the truth would come out, and that all the lies that he'd told about their personal life would be revealed, such as Ayn Rand suggesting an affair with someone else, or that Ayn Rand was merely trying to preserve a professional relationship for so long. Everything that they said in those books about Ayn Rand and the nature of that break was a lie, going back to 1968, when they made their first public statement about the break with Ayn Rand. That was a public lie. So, no.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And again, the material will be available again. And folks, you can track this down. There are still lending libraries where these works are available. So, Pal Reason in the chat says, my introduction to Ayn Rand was The Virtue of Selfishness. And I loved Brandon's articles. I was heartbroken to find that he was not the person that he could have been. And I think that's part of the explanation, unquote, our friend here in the chat. He was not the person he could have been. He could have and should have lived up to essentially what he started when he got to know Ayn Rand. I can't believe there was nothing there. He should have been a better man, and he wasn't. He decided not to be.
I have to totally agree. His articles for the Objectivist newsletter and the Objectivist were just brilliantly insightful in many cases. His book, The Psychology of Self-Esteem, I got a great deal of value from. Now, I think most of those ideas he got straight from Ayn Rand, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. When he read other cognitive psychologists who were beginning to emerge at the time, his disagreements were founded in Ayn Rand's philosophy. His agreements were founded in Ayn Rand's philosophy. He could have and should have known better. But if I compare, for example, his basic principles course that he gave in the 1960s at the Nathaniel Branden Institute, and which you can find basically republished in, I think it was 2014, The Vision of Ayn Rand, something like that, he published that. And you compare it to Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, you can see how profound the difference is in their understanding. Nathaniel Branden's understanding of Objectivism was disorganized, superficial, and a fraction of Dr. Peikoff's understanding of Objectivism. The issues we're discussing, say, on these Sunday seminars with Peikoff's courses are about the hierarchical nature of the ideas in Objectivism, things like that. All of those issues, Nathaniel Branden was completely blind to, utterly invisible to. He did not understand Objectivism in the profound way Peikoff did. He had every reason to believe it was that profound. He just never explored that profundity with Ayn Rand herself. And so his presentations of ideas are comparatively superficial in my view. And of course, his stated disagreements are just outright lies that he knows better. I was the one who, after Ayn Rand's death, he waited till Ayn Rand's death to come out with his speech, The Benefits and the Hazards of the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. I confess one of the great mistakes of my life was to sponsor that, to put him on at a university. I was a teenager, I admit I was young and ignorant, and I didn't quite know what was going on. But I arranged that lecture, introduced him, asked the questions from the audience, and now I realize that speech is dishonest in how he discusses Ayn Rand, and on the other hand, also displays the degree of his superficial shallowness of his understanding of Ayn Rand. Both.
But I think that gives you additional credibility as a critic of Ayn Rand's critics. You were there. You were not just somebody who was a fan of Ayn Rand, knew nothing about the Brandons and never met him, and just wanted to fling mud. No, you were there. You knew the guy. You worked with him essentially, and then realized what was going on there.
Yes, I interviewed him at his home in Beverly Hills. I introduced him at that speech. I got to know him a little bit in the early 1980s after Ayn Rand's death. There were things about him that bothered me, I have to admit. And when I learned better, I realized just how he had taken me in. And that's why, in part, I wrote this book.
Outstanding. We've got a few more comments in the chat, but we've also got a super chat from Walter. Walter Bishak is in for €2. We appreciate that. Anybody else wants to support the Ayn Rand Center UK, you know what to do. Some of you are already members, but if you're not, there's a link at the top of the chat to become a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK. And any super chats you put in, any comments you put in with a couple dollars on it, all goes support the ARCUK, an organization near and dear to all of us, deserves your support. You help make that happen. You help keep the lights on at ARC UK Towers in England. So thank you for that. Let me jump to the second question here, because Leonard Peikoff was asked, what should one do with respect to certain individuals who call themselves objectivists, but who are potentially harmful to the future of objectivism? Now, this is an update to this question, and something that for years, well, objectivists have been accused of schismists, of being sort of hair trigger to throw people out. So this is an interesting question and an interesting answer to me. The questioner asks, what, if anything, is morally required? Now think for a second, folks, if you've never heard Leonard Peikoff answer this, especially if you haven't heard him answer it in the last 10 or 20 years, what you think the answer is going to be. Leonard Peikoff says, I would say nothing is morally required. As a general rule, people who are, quote, harmful to objectivism, unquote, are legion, and it is inherent in any philosophy. You can't have a controversial philosophy without every variant attacking it, or distorting it, or suppressing it. The only thing you can do, if you want to counter that whole negative onslaught, is boycott the people involved. Don't do anything to help them or sanction them. Although I'll quickly add that you can buy books or literature from them to the extent that it's necessary to understand an opposed viewpoint and take action against it. A person who distorts objectivism is more harmful than an actual opponent. If you attack an idea openly, it's one against one, and people can choose. But if you distort it so that it's one against a limping one, well, then you lose. An example of that is in regard to capitalism, the socialists versus the Republicans.
Amen.
And that's interesting to me. Both the idea that, well, you're not morally required to do anything about these people. And if you are going to fight them, you do want to concentrate more on the people who misrepresent your ideas than your opposition.
Absolutely. If someone misrepresents Ayn Rand's ideas, they're comparatively low risk. Anyone can go look up the truth about Ayn Rand. I'm not saying we ignore them, just a simple observation. You got that wrong. When Whittaker Chambers said that Ayn Rand was a forthright materialist philosophically in his review of Atlas Shrugged, all you needed was a letter to the editor to point out, dude, you haven't even read the book. Ayn Rand is blasting through the materialism, idealism dichotomy. And if you missed that, you missed a good deal of the book. Please go back and read this book you claim to have the knowledge to review. So that is comparatively a minor threat. If it's someone who knew Ayn Rand and is claiming to represent, this is what Ayn Rand said, and I was an associate of Ayn Rand like Nathaniel Branden, then I think we have to go out of our way to say, this is how he misrepresented her ideas. Let's take Barbara Branden. When Barbara Branden, in her biography of Ayn Rand, The Passion of Ayn Rand, says that Ayn Rand ignored the intuitive aspects of her, nature, or she ignored her feminine instincts, or if she, she uses phrases like this repeatedly, it's peppered throughout her book, without any explanation. Now, Ayn Rand went into deep explanations of what these are, what it meant, any validity that the concept might have, and then the invalidity of resting on these ideas. I mean, you can imagine what Ayn Rand would have said about a concept like feminine instincts. In any event, Barbara Branden's bandying these words about, indicating, of course, that without any further explanation of how Ayn Rand might have answered it, she indicates just how shallow and superficial an understanding of Ayn Rand she has. Barbara Branden didn't have the brain pans to really understand objectivism, or she didn't have the commitment and the honesty to do it. But I'm not going to psychologize her. Whatever the cause, she obviously had a terribly superficial Ayn Rand, understanding of Ayn Rand. When you look at her biography, for example, if she talks about Ayn Rand, she'll have a sense of humor here, but a sense of humor is alien to Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand on so many occasions was sensitive to my personal context in a non-judgmental way. Oh, but Ayn Rand could be such a harsh moralist. And when she presents this without any attempt to smooth it out and understand it, you can see just how superficial and shallow her grip on objectivism itself was.
Yes. We've got a lot of comments in the chat about the relationship between Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden, some of which are very interesting. But I want to jump to a super chat from Rhett Henderson. Thank you very much for your support. And he says, well, I'm new to objectivism. Most of my friends are Christians. Advice on judging who to bring along. Is sense of life a good indicator? Some of the most principled are very distorted, but maybe still virtuous? I think a lot of us were Christians before we came to objectivism, so that's not necessarily a deal breaker there.
Yeah, I confess I was a Christian at one point. I'd abandoned my Christianity before I discovered Ayn Rand. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It depends upon how seriously they take Christianity, how deep the mysticism as an epistemological method goes, how deeply they're affected by the anti-life ethics that mystically generated philosophies always produce, and in Christianity in particular. So it's a question how seriously they take it and how deeply they understand it. Many Christians in North America today, or Great Britain today, really are only very superficially Christian. They don't understand, they don't take turn the other cheek literally, love your enemy literally, submit to the evildoer literally. They act to be selfish to some degree. They act to be rational to some degree. And in fact, contemporary Christianity has cut a lot of its ties from the New Testament, and much to its great improvement. So it really depends upon the person. I find that people who have are starting to question the religion they were brought up with, when they're beginning to abandon that, when they're in a sort of a transition mode, that's the most fertile time to do it. But I wouldn't, if they're a good person, if they're a person you love, playing chess with on Sundays, I wouldn't change my relationship and make being an objectivist a precondition if you've got a positive value for value win-win kind of relationship going on with them. On the other hand, the closer they get to you, the more important they are to you. Being a philosophical person, as I know you are, the more important how their philosophy is and how seriously they treat values becomes. So yeah, I wouldn't write off Christians by no means. I've known people who've gone from being what they called sincere Christians to being, maybe not objectivists philosophy for Ragnar, as Ayn Rand said, at that academic level, but certainly objectivists for Hank Rearden at that level. And I've seen numerous cases of that.
Excellent. And to Rhett's says, is sense of life a good indicator? If you didn't hear last week's episode of Peikoff Wednesdays, you might give that a listen, because the question came up in which it was stated, Leonard Peikoff stated, that Ayn Rand made a distinction between two kinds of people. There were people who agreed with her sense of life in the sense of her fiction, her view of the world, but didn't necessarily agree with her explicit concepts or philosophical ideas. And there were other people who did, who thought her philosophy was right on point, but thought that her view of the world and her fiction and her stories were superficial and didn't like those. And of course, most people like both, but in these two groups, she's told Leonard Peikoff she regarded the first as her allies and was suspicious of the second. I think Leonard says she said they were enemies. And so to your question, is sense of life a good indicator? It's a good start. As an indicator, yes, it's certainly not going to tell you anything for sure. But yes, by all means, if folks share that sense of life, that life is an end in itself, that specifically your life, your individual life is an end in itself, then yes, I think that's a very good sign to your question, Rhett. So let me jump to the third question, and these are all tied together, so we're not skipping anything here. Leonard Peikoff was asked, how could Alan Greenspan go from writing, the essay Golden Economic Freedom in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, to being such a corrupt and intellectually dishonest statist? And Dr. Peikoff started his answer by saying, this is a question on which I have been deliberately silent for decades. Those of us who've been in objectivism for a long time know that. And I'm not going to go into a torrent of denunciation here, but I will say something briefly. And Leonard Peikoff says, all I can do is give you some observed facts through the years. In the 1950s, which is when I knew Alan, he was actually a totally different person from what he obviously is today. He's just not the same person now. I'll give you a personal, a biographical touch that I would guess would be relevant here. In the early days when both Alan and I were getting to know Ayn Rand, she observed that there was a difference between us, that we both committed a certain error in opposite directions. I gave too much emphasis to the moral and not enough to the practical. Oops, excuse me. And Alan gave too much emphasis to the practical and not enough to the moral. She told us we each had to work to correct this error and not separate mind from body, unquote, Leonard Peikoff. And that he's right. That's a very insightful story to tell about how Alan Greenspan obviously found himself clinging to what he regarded as the practical and leaving morality aside.
He became a politician.
Yes.
You know, it began with, you know, he was one of the most difficult to get along with Ayn Rand to certain ideas. They got along, but getting him to get to certain ideas was a little tricky. For a while, he wasn't sure whether he existed or not. And so there's a sort of a joke among Ayn Rand's friends at the time. Alan exists. He admits it was a breakthrough moment that when Alan Greenspan agreed that he existed, and he was certain of that, was a great moment. He was kind of a logical positivist. He was deeply into Keynesian economics even when Ayn Rand met him. An interesting fellow. He studied music at the Juilliard, and so fascinating guy at the time. And he did show an incredible interest and admiration for Ayn Rand for so long. But if on the psychoepistemological error spectrum, it can be placed, I think, safely. It's over on that empiricist side. It took him a long time to grasp things in terms of abstractions and principles. The disappointing thing is the question brings up a really good point. Here is a guy who understood that gold was the only moral money, that if it was anything but commodity money, the government is in effect like a counterfeiter. It's dishonest. It's dishonest. It's immoral. It's theft. It's stealing from savers at the expense of borrowers. It is a redistribution of wealth that inflation always is, a kind of theft, just like money counterfeiters are. And for him to go from that in the late 1960s to his testimony when he's being approved to be the chairman of the United States Federal Reserve Board, the single most economically powerful person in the country, and he was the longest serving Fed chairman. In order to get that important post, he had to say things that absolutely flatly contradicted what he had said earlier. And so one has to say, did you change your opinion? He never said that. If you've changed your opinion, what is the basis? He never explained that. But why have you changed your opinion so dramatically? Either he never grasped it in the first instance, right? The principle was being an empiricist. He only understood it in a very concrete bound way, and therefore never really grasped the principle. And he was just really motivated as a politician to appease his political masters, Nixon, Reagan, you name it, Clinton from that point forward, to get political, to get ahead politically, which he did, certainly. I mean, you have someone like Bob Woodward doing a biography of him called Maestro at the time. He is a master of the planned economy without any kind of pushback that way. You really have to wonder if he ever really grasped the principles in the first instance.
Well, and maestro is such a good description because it gives the idea of a musician integrating all of these different aspects of the world. Philosophy is irrelevant, almost like a maestro who doesn't know music theory, or who does but doesn't regard it as important. Is it just the ultimate pragmatist? When I think of Alan Greenspan, I immediately think of Robert Stadler, except instead of blowing up multiple counties of the country, he blew up the economy and then wouldn't take the blame. Leonard Peikoff wraps up his answer by saying, well, I think there's another motive here too. If he were to face what the actual cause was, and he's talking about the financial crisis, he would have to discover that a very big part of it is the behavior of the Federal Reserve in the final years under his jurisdiction. It's perhaps easier for him, if ideas aren't that important, to blame the philosophy rather than saying, I'm the cause of the disaster, or at least part of the cause, unquote.
The
Yes.
institution leading, there is no good Fed policy. They kept zero, just to review recent history, they kept zero interest rates in part because Trump was jawboning them to keep zero interest rates, creates this world we're now living in the inflationary results of. But by the way, the fact of the matter is that there is no good Fed policy. Now the Fed is having to clamp down on the economy, destroy the economy, throw people out of work. And Alan Greenspan, rather than saying, I was right in the 60s, there is no good, sane policy. And what I'm doing here at the end will have negative consequences. There's no way around it. That would, of course, been honest and consistent with the principle that there should be separation between state and economics. And he, as the Federal Reserve guy, was actually lying about the negative effects that Fed policy must have, and certainly did have, as he's leaving office. Yeah.
Just so. Another super chat. Thank you, Bonnie. And she also says there's no index. What are the Greenspan pages? I noticed that in our notes, we forgot to put in the page number for that one question. Look on page 331. I love that we've got folks following along in the book at home. It's such a great collection. And we've had a couple of people tell us they picked up the book just because of these discussions, which is absolutely the right thing to do. Outstanding. Yeah. Christopher Smith in the chat says, yeah, what if we get a board to regulate the board to smooth it out? We need pragmatists in charge of the pragmatists so they can get the practical people to be more practical. That'll work.
And as we know, another government agency is always the solution, and it will fix the problem. No, they always make matters worse and create new and different problems.
Yes. We joke when we talk about the idea of a creator of the universe. Well, who created the creator? And you go to Eastern mysticism where you have the world on top of the back of elephants and they're on the back of a giant turtle. And well, what's under the turtle? And the joke is it's turtles all the way down. And the same answer with these pragmatists. Which regulatory agency will finally be able to regulate all the regulators? No, it's regulators all the way down.
Exactly. You look at all these different regulations causing problems. I think of the train derailment in Ohio. I think of, you can just name whatever it is, and you can unpeel the layers and layers and layers of causes the government has, contributed to create such a thing from happening. That will leave people indifferent. They will still, we need another layer of regulations, because after all, nearly nationalizing the railroads and having them totally controlled by government was such a success. You can see how how well it works. And instead of someone saying, "Hey, wait a minute, doesn't this trail derailment point to disaster in our railroad semi-socialist policy?" No, we need more regulations.
Yeah, they shudder at the thought of decontrolling. The protagonist of Atlas Shrugged asks the regulators exactly that question when they say, well, how do we fix this? And he says, just get rid of those agencies. They shudder, they shiver, they literally think, well, no, the regulators must have made things a little better, and we just need to keep regulating even more because the whole problem was we weren't regulated. They can't conceive of the fact that individuals can be self-directed and that would lead to the ideal result.
Utterly blind to the positive impact of the free market, utterly blind to the impact of regulations and ultimately of socialism, historically and factually.
Yeah, if you've got a copy of Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal handy, read that essay by Alan Greenspan for the answer that, unfortunately, at some point, I was going to say he forgot, but he didn't forget. He betrayed it. He became Dr. Robert Stadler. He became the ultimate amoral pragmatist.
In that sense, I would have to categorize him along with the Brandons. Close enough to Ayn Rand to have known better. They saw her, that if they did not understand it completely, they understand the revolutionary depth to some degree, and then betrayed it, That's exactly the way to look at it.
It's fascinating to me because I tend to be the opposite. I tend to, if I go in any direction, I go in the opposite direction of being a little too earthy, which is why I have a show called Life on Earth. But that's the whole premise of my show is these ideas can and will change the world. But the most important thing is this is the operating manual for life. And I just feel like Alan Greenspan must have never realized, oh, wait, these ideas are actually about real life.
Life.
Just floating.
That's it. These people never really understood. At some superficial level, they could say, oh, this is a revolution. This is a whole new insight. This has changed my thinking about this, or changed my thinking about that. They really never understood that it was a philosophy for living on Earth. They never got down and dug into the earth like you and I do, Robert, on a regular basis here. They didn't understand the importance of philosophy, its role in life, the things that Ayn Rand kept stressing over and over and over. And here you can't blame Ayn Rand for being subtle and assuming that someone would get some subtle philosophical point. This is a big fat point that they simply did not choose to investigate thoroughly or had completely betrayed.
It's scary to think, like Hillary Rodham Clinton, they had their Ayn Rand phase. Theirs just lasted years, and they were able to fool Ayn Rand, at least for a while. And let's address that. But first, let me say thank you to Jupiter Menace in the chat with a super chat for $5, supporting the Ayn Rand Center UK. Very much appreciated. Thank you. And he says, glad I was able to catch this live today. It's great that you are here live. I love the chat, love the comments, appreciate the super chat. If you are listening afterward, if you're listening to the podcast, you can still go to the YouTube, this particular episode, put in a comment below, and you'll see, just like in the chat, a $sign where you can send a couple dollars the ARCUK's way. Very much appreciated. I've got folks who do super thanks more often than they do super chat, and it's great. It's great that you can do that after the fact as well. Oh, and right there, right on cue, pops up a generous super chat from Wes Stewart, who says, love these shows, been going through the backlog of the ones I've missed. Thank you. I appreciate that too. Our producer, Daniel, behind the scenes, who makes all this happen, has been putting these on the podcast platforms as well. In fact, I usually listen into our show because, James, sometimes I'm reading in the book, I'm following the chat. I will miss something that you said. I'll hear it on the podcast afterward. I use Apple Podcasts, but it's on all the platforms. I'll be like, James is even smarter than I realized. And I totally missed some important insights. So yes, watch on YouTube, use the super thanks after the fact, go on the podcast platforms, listen to it. Great during a workout. People are like, no, I need death metal when I do workouts. But I'm actually somebody who will listen to the Yarn Brook show or listen to the Ayn Rand Center UK podcasts at the gym. And it really gets me going. Some of these topics, oh man, that'll make you run.
Fired up and pumping that. Yeah. Boy, do I know that feeling.
Yes. And let's see. Oh, Ann in the chat, who has been defending some of these folks, says Greenspan nor the Brandons aren't anywhere near as bad as Hillary. Ooh, there's an interesting question. Who is more, well, I'll just use the word bad because that's the word she used. Who is more bad? People like Alan Greenspan or the Brandons, or somebody like Hillary Clinton?
There's really two ways of looking at that, aren't there?
Yeah.
The extent that Alan Greenspan and the Brandons had a better grip on Ayn Rand, the revolution of Ayn Rand's thought, they are worse. They are bigger betrayers. They betrayed something. Hillary Clinton, if her understanding as a teenager was superficial of Ayn Rand, she only got certain, say, aesthetic or psychological points, and then, it was a sense of life thing for her, and then she moved on to socialism and whatever. Okay, she never really grokked it. She never grasped it. So she was betraying less. Now, on the other hand, was Hillary Clinton an active destroyer of the American political scene? Yeah, in a way that, say, Nathaniel Brandon or Barbara Brandon. But how about Alan Greenspan? Alan Greenspan gave his sanction to the Clintons. Alan Greenspan gave his sanction to George W. Bush. Alan Greenspan gave his sanction ultimately to the Federal Reserve System itself, saying things that like, well, gold, commodity money, gold money is out of the question now, as he's being interviewed by Congress. Now that is far more harmful coming from an associate of Ayn Rand's than it would come from anyone else. So I'm not so sure you're right. I think Alan Greenspan's betrayal of true free market ideas, for example, is far, far worse than, say, Hillary Clinton saying, I went through an Ayn Rand phase as a teenager or something, because it's clear whatever turned her on to Ayn Rand was a very superficial thing.
Yeah, I can't even I don't see them on the same scale, like in the same measure. So they're different kinds of bad. And that's why I've spent a lot more time and a lot more money fighting Hillary Clinton. But I have spent a lot more time in terms of denunciations fighting Alan Greenspan. And I don't talk much about the Brandons, but that's because it's something I don't even. Ugh.
Yeah, sometimes the closer they are to us, and in fact, I'll make this general rule, the closer you perceive them to be to your ideas, the more demanding you should be of that person. You really should. If someone's, on one side a Christian fundamentalist or on the other side a total Marxist socialist, right? That's one thing. If someone says, "Oh no, I sympathize with your approach to, holding reason as an absolute," or "I sympathize with your approach to individual rights and individualism," and then they contradict it, they were at least clued in that there was something deeper and more profound going on here. And rather than understanding that all the way down and exploring that all the way down, they kept it at a superficial level, and in effect were in a position to tar Ayn Rand with it because of their association or praise of Ayn Rand. Say Donald Trump. Donald Trump says The Fountainhead is his favorite novel. Now, that is absolutely inconceivable to me. He is the opposite of a principled person. He's the opposite of an individualist in every way. And in many ways, he is a worse opponent of the free market than even, and I put this as even a lot of Republicans. Now, when he says something like that, it is dangerous. But look, we can easily correct that. Donald Trump is so anti-objectivist in so many ways. A simple observation from our friends at the Ayn Rand Institute will disabuse you of that notion in about 5 seconds. Coming from someone like Nathaniel Branden or Alan Greenspan, that can distort people's views of Ayn Rand, and that, in that sense, it's far more dangerous.
Excellent. Let me jump to question 4 here before we start running low on time, because I know I've got another date today, and that's going to be good too. But real quick here, because I mentioned Hillary in this context, Leonard Peikoff was asked, too many people say to me, well, I too went through the Ayn Rand phase when I was in high school. How should I take this? Man, just asked like that. It's like a slap in the face. Yeah, I went through the phase. How come you never got out of it? But no, Leonard Peikoff answers, well, what does phase mean? Well, the person had some kind of interest, enthusiasm for a short time and then gave it up. Well, why? The most superficial reason would be just that the person liked one of the novels or one of the characters in a superficial way. He reacted in the same way he might to Star Wars. He liked it, he was enthusiastic, but it didn't go very far. He got to another stage in his life and it just fell away because to him it was just a childhood type thing. Obviously, it couldn't be of profound importance. It was a surface thing. You could say he's not profound, but that's it. Let me stop the Leonard Peikoff quote there just to say, well, that's what happened to me. I read The Fountainhead in high school, identified with the character, thought it was great, and then went on to other things. It wasn't until I was 24, 25 years old that I came across it again, remembered, oh yeah, that was great. I should reread that. And that's when it hit me. Okay, going on with Leonard Peikoff's answer. Another person could be at a deeper level and really get some of the key ideas, but then find out when he goes out into the world that makes him very unpopular. People jump down his throat when he says he's for selfishness or pure capitalism or atheism. And then he makes a deliberate choice. Well, all those ideas are fine, but I want to get along in the world, so goodbye, Ayn Rand. That is a much worse phenomenon. That is self-sabotage, whereas the first type didn't get that far. And then he says here, I think one of the worst cases, or perhaps another variant, is the person who says, not so much I want to be popular as Well, Ayn Rand was great when I was idealistic, but now I see that the idealistic can't be reconciled with the practical. I'll close quote from Leonard Peikoff there, but isn't that what we've been talking about?
And
Isn't
mhm. And that's exactly it. I would put Nathaniel Branden and Alan Greenspan into that category. No, I don't think they grasped objectivism anything like the way that Dr. Leonard Peikoff did. They did not. They weren't philosophers. Perhaps they didn't understand the depth of her philosophical revolution. But to the extent they did understand Ayn Rand's ideas, they absolutely betrayed them. They absolutely betrayed them. And in the sense, and you get this distinctly from both of them, in the sense of making friends, in the sense of being popular with the right group. People that Nathaniel Branden knew to be mistaken and dishonest, he reestablished connections with in the libertarian movement, for example, and ignored those as if Ayn Rand was just being a ridiculous moralist about those differences, when of course they had only a superficial grip on Ayn Rand's ideas too, and in many cases had offended her in profound ways, or hurt her in profound ways, or lied about her in profound ways. But of course, Rand was the moralist. And so it comes down to that. You're right. They never really grasped the revolution of Ayn Rand on something like the moral and the practical. They never really grasped the theme of Atlas Shrugged. Now, on some superficial level, did they appreciate it to say, yeah, when I was young and idealistic, but now that I've grown up and become practical, talk about a misunderstanding of Ayn Rand. Or to the extent that they did understand something like that was going on, they simply betrayed it in the name of, let's put it in another term, social metaphysics, to be popular with the right group, or to advance their career, whether as a psychotherapist in Beverly Hills or as a politician in Washington, D.C. And both of those gentlemen did make millions and millions of dollars doing both of those things, and in part because of the reputation that Ayn Rand had helped give them in the 1960s. So they cashed in on their connection with Ayn Rand in big ways, but only by betraying Ayn Rand, no better than Peter Keating.
Yes. Well, I think I can wrap up our discussion with the tail end of Dr. Peikoff's answer to this question. But first, let me say that you are on the Ayn Rand Center UK channel on YouTube. And if you stay tuned, if you click on the link for the channel, the next show coming up is the Daily Objective. Now, every day at 6 p.m. UK time, 1 o'clock on the East Coast, 10 o'clock on the West Coast, the left coast, as it were, the Daily Objective is presented. Outstanding programming from the Ayn Rand Center UK. This is the kind of programming you are supporting with your super chats, with your ARCUK membership. You can even join the YouTube channel. There's for a small fee there. You can be part of that and have access to things that only we who've done that have access to. So thank you for your support. At 1 o'clock Eastern time, 6 o'clock UK, 10 o'clock West Coast, how legitimate are native land claims in Canada? Are we, as Canadians, all living and working on stolen native land? Well, here in the States, of course, we're asked that same question. This is very much a hot button issue these days, but what are the historical and legal implications of this idea? Well, today's episode of the Daily Objective includes our legal expert, you, James Valliant, as well as Nicholas Krusek. Now, some folks know Nicholas as an expert on music, and he's been on the Daily Objective talking about music history, music theory, classical music. But Nicholas is also a resident of Canada. So this should be an outstanding discussion.
I hope it will be. And, Native American rights and, didn't European immigrants steal North America from natives? The same question occurs in Australia and New Zealand. Doesn't New Zealand belong to the Maori? Didn't British people steal New Zealand from the Maori, et cetera, et cetera. So please tune in to this. I think we will have some answers you maybe have never heard before.
I hope so. And I hope you will address the question, well, shouldn't historical wrongs be made right by, for example, reparations, or at least a certain amount of white guilt? Now, why do I mention that? Well, of course, right here, I've got a copy of this magnificent tome, Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Yes, tomorrow on Life on Earth. I usually keep it very positive because there's enough fighting going on elsewhere, but I've got to talk about racism. I've got to talk about Ayn Rand's ideas about racism. I've got to talk about Ibram X. Kendi's ideas about racism. So I want to hear if y'all and Nicholas have anything to say about reparations.
Whatever we say, folks, do not miss Robert's next program. His recent programs have been grand slams, knocking it straight out of the ballpark, okay? If you haven't seen him on effective altruism, if you haven't heard him discussing about his own life and the impact of objectivism, you have been missing some good stuff. Catch his Life on Earth podcasts. They are always filled with profound insights. And so I just want to wrap up by saying something I've been meaning to say for at least a year now, Robert. You give me the most wonderful introductions as someone so knowledgeable in objectivism. I have to throw that right back at you. You are such an expert on living these ideas, really trying to understand these ideas. And I learn every time. I'm inspired every time by your podcast. So thank you, my brother.
I do appreciate that. We have a little thanks in the super chat too. Jeff Bannister, always a generous contributor to the ARCUK, is in with $10 Canadian. I'm having a little fun with that because one of our past hosts was a little less appreciative of currencies that weren't sitting as high as the dollar or the euro or the pound. And Jeff Bannister sometimes got a little criticism. Oh, yeah, those are Canadian dollars. I love Jeff Bannister's Canadian dollars. I love the fact that he's in Canada, and I especially love the fact that he is saying thank you because you are going to be talking about this issue, important to Canadians, important to all of us in North America, wherever in the North Americas you are, and really anywhere, because again, it's going to tie in with my discussion tomorrow. But let me jump back to wrap up today's topic, because in regard to that fourth question, Leonard Peikoff wrapped up his answer this way. So there are different reasons why people go through an Ayn Rand phase and leave the ideas behind. You have to know what the reason was. But my last opinion of such people is this. You went through the phase, and so in whatever terms you could get it, you got it, and you don't want it. So goodbye, good riddance, and good luck. Well,
right.
All the reasons that we can dismiss and have a certain amount of contempt for those people, I want to express my respect and admiration for those of you who are not just going through an Ayn Rand phase, who do respect both the originator of these ideas and the ideas themselves. And to you, I want to say, good luck, no luck required. You're not going to need that, but good premises and good day.